All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Environmental Justice Now. So to start, my name is Kayla Simpson, and I'm one of the newest additions to the team, being the new Communications and Education Coordinator at Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. So before we start today, I'd like to do a brief land acknowledgement. While we are on a video call and many of us are joining from different places, we want to remind ourselves that we gather on the unceded land of the Indigenous peoples. I'm joining in from so-called Richmond, Virginia, and I'm on the land of the Powhatan and Chickahominy peoples. If you are unsure whose land you are on and want to find out, you can visit native-land-.ca to find out. All right, so this past Saturday, the Senate voted to pass a historic climate justice bill called the Inflation Reduction Act, with $369 billion for clean energy and climate. In this week's Environmental Justice Now, joining us to discuss the biggest climate and clean energy investment in our nation's history is Madison Mayhew, Interfaith Power and Light, DMV, federal policy advocate. Thank you, Madison, for joining us. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be with you today. I'm feeling pretty good. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm pretty excited to be doing this for the first time with the IPL. I'm excited to learn more about the IRA and what it can mean for our country.
Definitely.
Yeah. So to start, can you tell us what the IRA is and the journey that it has been to get the legislation passed?
Absolutely. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 is an extensive bill aiming to address the climate crisis, reduce healthcare costs, and promote accountability and fairness in the U.S. tax code. As we know, this originally started as Build Back Better, which was a big priority of President Biden that actually passed in the House very quickly into his administration, but there wasn't quite enough support in the Senate to get that done. There was a lot of back and forth over how to make that happen, and eventually, around the end of 2021, Congress agreed to remove the infrastructure pieces from the overall Build Back Better bill. And as we know, the infrastructure package has a lot of wins, but it did not have the environmental and social safety nets and investments that the original Build Back Better bill had. But just to highlight some of those wins, because I think there are some things definitely worth celebrating. In the infrastructure package, there was funding for EV chargers, funding to clean up legacy pollution, a little bit of funding to clean up drinking water and replace lead pipes, investments in a 21st century electrical grid, and even improvements to expand Amtrak and increase access to public transit. But because this piece did not include those pivotal and urgent pieces around environmental and social components, the fight for Build Back Better continued and eventually transitioned into what's called a reconciliation bill. And this is important because a reconciliation bill is a type of budget bill that allows the Senate to pass without a supermajority and avoid a filibuster. So a reconciliation bill can be passed with only 51 votes. And there was a lot of, as we know, push and pull to get Senator Manchin on board with these climate provisions that we wanted in the reconciliation package. And this went on for months. I know a lot of IPL affiliates worked really hard to make sure that Senator Manchin was on board and that their own senators were in support of these significant provisions. But about a month ago, maybe longer, Senator Manchin basically announced that Build Back Better was completely dead and there was no way that the bill could move forward. And because of the significant fight that had been put in place over the past, a little over a year to get a bill across the finish line, there was so much grief recognizing that our one window of opportunity had closed. Fast forward about 2 weeks later, Leader Schumer announced that he had come to a deal with Senator Manchin on a climate bill, which was a huge surprise to not just the climate community, but also staffers and senators. Apparently, these negotiations were really kept super tight and were kept behind closed doors. So when this was announced, there was a lot of excitement and energy to see what was in the bill and see, how this bill could relate to our communities. But also worth noting that because this is a reconciliation bill, it started a whole wonky process to get across the finish line. I won't go into the weeds here, but it's, as you mentioned, it passed the Senate this past weekend, and the House has been on recess, but we're called back today to vote on it. And so we'll know later at some point today when it passes the House and should head to President Biden's desk early next week.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey, hasn't it?
Really?
Yeah. No, we've been keeping tabs on it since Build Back Better, and we've really been trying to push forward for this climate justice bill to be passed. So yeah, it's very exciting that we're almost at the finish line. Yeah, thank you for giving more context to that.
Sure.
So moving forward, how do you think this legislation could benefit our nation and our local communities?
Yeah, this is, the big question of the legislation, right? And I think the biggest takeaways that I've seen and from what I understand is that the bill provides significant funding for clean energy that will help us transition off of fossil fuels in a really tangible and significant way, and is paid for by taxes on the largest billion-dollar corporations, many of whom don't pay taxes right now. And within the package, there are clean energy tax credits for wind and solar, EVs, efficiency upgrades, heat pumps, and so much more. It also allows nonprofit and public utilities to take advantage of direct payments instead of having to rely on that tax credit to help get that cash flow a little bit sooner. There's $60 billion for environmental justice priorities, including block grant opportunities and funding to clean up ports. There's up to $60 billion for domestic clean energy manufacturing, which increases our own energy security while also providing opportunities for good paying clean jobs. There's a $27 billion for a green bank, which is really exciting because this entity will provide loans and other forms of assistance to support the deployment of zero emissions technologies like solar. And then there's also the first direct federal methane fee, which has been, there's been a fight to include a methane fee in climate legislation for a very long time. So that's also a really exciting win.
Very cool. Thank you. Yeah. Clean energy, we got to really push for that. So that's exciting too. And I guess more specifically, why do you think faith communities should be excited about this legislation passing?
Definitely. I think as people of faith who care about our common home, there's certainly a lot worth celebrating in this bill. As I mentioned, this legislation provides the framework to transition off of fossil fuels. And as within my local IPL affiliate, IPL-DMV, we often talk about the urgency to turn away from burning. We burn fossil fuels in so many aspects of our lives, whether it's by the fuel that we put in our cars, the gas that we use to heat our homes, or even the gas that we cook in our kitchens. We've been learning a lot about the dangers of methane gas when within our homes, and when we cook with gas, it leads to toxic air pollutants that stay within our house, and this, which can significantly impact our health, our children's health, the people that we care about. And this bill really provides the framework for being able to transition off of those dirty energy sources and bring in clean energy sources that will not only benefit our overall climate goals, but will also deeply impact our ability to live clean and healthy lives. And I think it's also worth noting this bill isn't all that we had hoped for with Build Back Better in terms of the different funding opportunities. And we know that it still retains about 80% of the cumulative emission reductions, despite having that lower funding number, and remains the largest ever federal investment in climate action. And there's some models that have been put out that shows even with those differences, we can achieve emissions cuts of roughly 40% of around levels before 2005. And some some ways that the bill specifically impacts households is that it's estimated families will save an annual amount of $1,025 in energy savings by helping lower electricity costs and improving energy savings. And, I think another really helpful example in how this bill impacts houses of worship and congregations is the tax credits for solar on buildings, whether that be municipal buildings or nonprofits. The IPL-DMV group has been working with a cohort of congregations in Montgomery County to install solar panels on their houses of worship. And they've been really working to take advantage of the current tax credit at 26%, which has created a really fast turnaround. But the bill now not only extends the deadline for their projects, but increases their tax credit opportunity to 30%. And so there are really meaningful ways that projects can not only take off, but then have the amount of time that they need to really complete and be in a really stable position. As people of faith, it's also worth noting that there are some really troubling provisions in this bill. I think, we are called to pursue justice in support of oppressed communities and stand in solidarity with those on the front lines. And because Senator Manchin is the one who negotiated this bill, there are fossil fuel components that are very concerning, and we've heard grief from frontline communities about the potential harm of these provisions. And as people of faith who believe in the dignity and worth of all people, who believe in justice and the moral vision of healing, we have to stand together and fight back on those fossil fuel projects, particularly the Mountain Valley pipeline that could be approved through a separate permitting process, and other provisions that could continue to harm our frontline neighbors. And there will be opportunities to do that. So just want to make sure that we're honest about the legislation, that we can celebrate the good while also naming the bad.
No, yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that even though this is like a huge bill that could do a lot of good for communities and for our country, the work isn't done. Like, we're still going to have to continue that fight once this bill is hopefully passed. So
definitely.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And then our last question, since there has been a lot of pushback in finally getting the Senate to pass this legislation, what should we say to our neighbors who may be hesitant to support or have concerns about how this could positively impact our communities?
Yes, it's such a good question. And I think what I keep coming back to is that the research is clear. The transition away from burning fossil fuels is urgent. And this bill really lays the groundwork to make that happen for communities, families, and even individuals. And I think there's a lot of concerns about funding and where that comes from, but knowing that it comes from taxing the largest billion-dollar corporations who have gotten away with not paying taxes before is, a really significant piece we're celebrating. This doesn't take money from other necessary projects, but takes away from, greedy corporations. And I've seen, from what I understand and the reading that I've done, people across the board, whether that be Democrats, Republicans, former Treasury secretaries, have all come out and said that this bill will ultimately have a positive impact on inflation. I know that is a very real concern for a lot of Americans who are struggling to make ends meet or have rising costs and very basic needs. And recognizing that this bill addresses some of those concerns by not only turning away from fossil fuels and creating the infrastructure we need to transition to clean energy, but also addressing some healthcare and tax provisions as well. So there are very clear signs that this bill is really strong and worth celebrating.
Wonderful. Thank you for making that case. So yeah, hopefully Congress knows what to do next. And yeah, we'll continue that fight. So yeah, thank you so much, Madison, for your time and joining us today. to discuss the most significant U.S. climate justice legislation to date. And a big thank you to all our viewers for tuning in. And stay tuned to looking forward to next week's show, where we'll be discussing RGGI, which is Virginia's regional greenhouse gas initiative. So we'll be talking more about like local politics in the Virginia area. But yeah, thank you again, Madison.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.